Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Off the Rak, conversations on transformative leadership with yours truly, Walt Rakowich. If you're new to the show, hey, thanks for joining us. And if you're returning, welcome back. I'm really excited to introduce my guest today, Joel Manby. Joel is the author of Love Works, a book that highlights his approach to leadership that's focused on employee engagement, lower turnover, more satisfied customers, and of course, going along with that, better profitability. Joel worked at GM, Saturn, and then became CEO of Saab North America. Then he worked for Jeff Bezos as CEO of Greenlight.com. But I would say that he really learned the importance of loving his people when he became CEO of Hirsch & Family Entertainment, who, by the way, owned Dollywood and Silver Dollar City, among other great entertainment venues. And then his leadership philosophies were tested when he took over the role of CEO at SeaWorld. And we're going to hear a little bit more about that as well. Today, he talks to audiences and executives about why it's important to love your people and not love as an emotion, but as a behavior. Hey, Joel, welcome to Off the Rak. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Well, thanks, Walt. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's great to see you again.
Great to see you too. Okay, before we get started, you and I graduated from Harvard Business School together, and I know I saw you at least a couple times at the Boathouse Bar, at least a handful of times on Friday after class, I think, right?
Yeah, I think we were probably there. I think I saw you too, by the way.
I know I saw myself. All right, so I want to know your estimate of the number of drinks you had there over the 2 years we were in school.
Well, let me see. That's 9 months. That's 36 weeks. We're there every Friday times 2 years. That's over 70. I got to believe we're in the neighborhood of, 150.
I was just going to say, if I did the math, I'm at least between 125 and 150 drinks.
Yeah, it's as MBAs, we can do the math quickly, and that's kind of what it comes out to. I'm not proud of it, but
no, I can't say I'm proud of it, but it is reality, right?
Yeah, what a great school, what a great experience, and what great friendships there. It's just an amazing place.
It really is an amazing place, and I get to meet guys like you there. So, all right, so Joel, you're out with a book, Love Works. I read it. There's so much to unpack throughout your career. I mean, it's a career that was really filled with ups and downs, good days, bad days. You're really truthful about a lot of things in the book. And truth is that you came to believe that through it all, that love works in leadership. And as I said in the beginning, not love is an emotion, which is kind of where people get confused, but really love based on values, behaviors, actions. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit for us?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. Most people are not comfortable with it, Walt, right out of the chute. They misperceive love as an emotion, as you said, and it's really a language barrier. As we'll get to in a minute, when we define love, we base it off of a word called agape. And the Greeks have 4 different words for love, where Americans or English only has 1. So, for instance, in Greek, eros is romantic love. And that's what most people think of in America, when they hear love, they think of eros, they think of romance. Eros is where the word erotic comes from. Or there's another Greek word, philos, for brotherly love. That's what Philadelphia is named after. Or storge, which is parental love between a father and a son, or a mom and her daughter. Yeah. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a 4th Greek word, agape, which is a verb. It's a behavior. It doesn't matter, Walt, how you feel about somebody. It matters how you treat them. And we all work with people that we don't always get along with, or we don't necessarily care for, or we don't have energy for. But by leading with love, there are still certain behaviors that we need to teach ourselves to be better leaders. And at a very high level, I won't go into this in a lot of detail, but what we did at Hirsch Entertainment is we took agape as a word and we paraphrased it into 7 different words of love. And we took it actually from 1 Corinthians 13, which is a famous Bible verse written by Paul, the Apostle Paul. It's one of the few places in literature where love is defined. And when he wrote about love, he used agape. And so we paraphrase his famous verse as love is patient, it's kind, it's truthful, it's trusting, it's unselfish, and it's forgiving, and then it's dedicated. And we literally taught our leaders to lead this way. And we call them our be goals. We want to be this kind of leader. And we taught them these 7 words. And every company has do goals where you have to hit profit margin or whatever the numbers are. But we had both the do goals for the numbers, but the be goals in living to these 7 words of love. So at a very high level, I mean, there's tons we could unpack on every word if you wanted to, but in essence, that's what made our culture so different, is teaching leaders to love according to these 7 words.
Even if you don't read the Bible, if you've gone to a wedding, the likelihood is that you've heard 1 Corinthians 13.
Yes.
Yeah, because, almost every wedding, it seems like it's recited. And so that's interesting. So at the end of the day, you sort of patterned what you did at Hershen. And by the way, we're going to talk a little bit about Hershen in a moment, but I think that's very interesting to clear up the confusion on what you mean by love, because a lot of people would say, well, look, I don't love that person that I work with,
right?
But that you're not saying that. You're saying it's how you treat them, it's how you behave them. Right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, it's totally. We have to eliminate that mindset of the love we think of between a parent and a child, or with your significant other or your children. That's eros, or that's storge, or that's the other types of love. This is completely different. It's very appropriate for work, and it absolutely gets the best out of people.
So I'm going to go backward a little bit, because I want to spend the majority of the time talking and digging into this a little bit further. But let's go back to the early days of your career. You and I graduate. You worked at GM, and then Saturn, and then became the CEO of Saab North America at a very young age. Very before any of our classmates were CEOs, you were. And then
careful what you wish for,
right? Right. And then you worked for Jeff Bezos as CEO of Greenlight.com, which was a startup, basically Amazon's version of an online car dealership, I think, back then. But you were incredibly driven and successful at an early age, really, in your career. And yet in your book, you talk about not being fulfilled. I think that's really interesting, because so many people want to climb the mountain, want to climb it early, but you weren't fulfilled. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate you clarifying for the listeners. There were certainly ups and downs. Yeah, I had a lot of success in my career, but I've also had some failures, and you learn a lot from that. But I think at a high level, Walt, I really struggled internally with the intersection of faith and work. And I have to say, I mean, this is just my personal belief system. I'm not trying to sell anybody on my belief system, but I grew up as a Christian. My mom was a very strong believer. And so I was taught always that Jesus' number 1 commandment was to love others. And by the way, when Jesus talks about love, and of course it's written in Greek, the New Testament is written in Greek, they always use agape when Jesus talks about love too, not eros or any others. So I always went into work with this home life love taught to me. And I get into General Motors, and as far as culture and as far as love, it could not have been the more opposite extreme from what my mother taught me and what my dad tried to teach me about loving other people. And so there was always this huge disconnect in my soul. I would call it, Walt, I had this angst in my soul, and it lasted for years, because the old GM, and I'm not saying GM's like this anymore, but in those days, it was very fear-based. You picture these guys, and they're sometimes drinking scotch, smoking cigars in the middle of meetings, swearing at people, accusing them of being worthless. And if you don't hit your numbers, you're gone. And it was just very intimidating, fear-based culture, which, by the way, doesn't get the best out of people. People aren't creative. They're not innovative. They don't take risks. it was just a train wreck from a culture standpoint. I rose up in the midst of it, and I hit my numbers and I did really well, as you've already mentioned. But during that whole time, I would say I just had an emptiness in my soul that I am disconnecting who I am when I go into work. I tried not to play their games. I tried to treat people like I felt they should be treated. But when no one around you is doing it, and certainly it's not the culture at the top, you still feel a disconnect and you feel this angst. And so I would say my disenchantment was that disconnection. I'd go home, I'd go to church, I'd be with my family. I felt like I could be one way. I'd go into work and I felt like I had to turn that off. And that really wears on a human being. I bet you if you polled your listeners, because I do this every time I give a keynote, I ask everybody in the audience, how many of you have worked in an environment like I just described? And it's always over 50%, sometimes 80 or 90%. And then I ask, how many of you feel like there has to be a better way? And so if any of your listeners are out there saying, I've worked in a culture like that, I felt that angst, I felt like, or feel like there has to be a better way. Part of the reason I wrote the book is so your listeners who are going through that, they don't feel alone. Because I felt alone, and I thought I was the only one who felt that way until I got to the theme park industry, and we'll get into that later. But that's really where my discontent came from. It wasn't from lack of success or lack of fulfillment operationally in my job. It was more of a spiritual internal issue.
And it was that way somewhat at Saab as well, right?
Yeah, I will say as I progressed and I became CEO, I was much more able to form the culture. But I will say even at Saab, it was difficult because I reported to a man in Sweden. Saab's a Swedish company, and he ran the whole company. He set the culture. So even as I did what I did, I always felt in conflict, and that angst is still there. It wasn't until I got to Herschend Entertainment, that I understood what it meant to have ownership and top leaders buy into this in a way that the whole company just churned and got the flywheel going, and the culture just, as you said earlier, created great guest satisfaction, great employee satisfaction, and great financial results. So that was at the root of my discontent. Sorry.
So then one day your phone rings, and it's Jack Herschend, chairman of the board of Herschend Entertainment Company, and one of the largest entertainment companies in the world. Yeah. And Jack asked you to take over the company. Said he'd like you to take over the company. I want to know how you feel how you felt when he called you.
Well, I have to back up a little on that because it's just an incredible story. It truly was a miracle, a stroke of luck, or a God thing, depending on what your faith background is. For me, it was a God thing. The Amazon startup, we got caught up in the .com implosion. People don't remember, Walt, that at that time, Amazon wasn't cash flowing, and there was a lot of question whether they were going to make it or not. And so, Bezos had to make a decision of what assets to keep or shed in the middle of the .com meltdown, and ours was not one of them. And so we had to sell the company in a fire sale. So I knew I was going to be out of a job. I had told Jack Herschend that, and it's important for your listeners to know, I was already on the board of Herschend Entertainment. When I was at Saab, he asked me to be on the board. So I had been a board member for 2 years, and he knows that I'm looking for a job. I told him I was going to go back to General Motors. I had a job offer actually to go back and run Cadillac, and I was going to do that. But he calls me and says, Joel, I've seen your heart. I know you know nothing about theme parks, but I believe in your leadership, and I'd like you to take over the company. And Walt, he had been the only leader for 40 years as chairman. And so the risk he took to put someone who knows nothing about theme parks into that role was honoring to me in a way I can't even describe. But the kind of funny thing about the story is at the time it was just the chairman role, and he didn't offer me very much money, and it was way below what I was going to make at Cadillac. So I asked him for a $20,000 more a couple weeks later. And he said, let's pray about that. He didn't say yes. He goes, let's pray about that. And so he prays that I'll find something for $20,000. He doesn't give me the 20. He asked me to pray about it. And no, this is not a lie. The next day, I get a call from a search executive offering me a board seat at a bank for $20,000 a year.
No way.
And so
Oh my gosh.
I called him back. I told him the story. I said, I'm saying no to Cadillac. I'm going to join you guys. And it was the best decision I've ever made, because while I was at the board meetings, I saw something in this company that I had never seen in business. The way that the employees loved each other, the way they loved on their customers. Theme park business is a tough business. I mean, you're out on it's long days, serving in hot weather, serving guests. And I saw something, and I knew I wanted to be part of it. But that's the story of how I went from automobiles to theme parks, was Jack Hershen's call.
And the company had been run that way for some time. Am I right?
Yeah. So, I'm glad you clarified that, because I didn't bring the culture of love to Hershen Entertainment. It was there. But the business issue, and a lot of your listeners who have multi-unit businesses, and I know you know this from your extensive experience in this, where Jack lived, and he has a brother named Pete, and where Jack and Pete were in Branson, Missouri, where the headquarters were, the culture was thick, it was great, it was energized. But you got farther and farther away from Branson, Missouri, even at Dollywood in East Tennessee or our other parks around the country, the culture was really diminished and not very good. And our guest scores were lower, our employee scores were lower, and our profitability margins were lower at all the other properties. So my job was to figure out how to define what Jack and Pete were as leaders and put a vernacular to it. So they did not have the 7 words of love. That I will take some credit for that. I worked with one of the family members who was on the board, Chris Hershen, and we developed those 7 words of love and said, this exemplifies Jack and Pete. And then we had to figure out how do you execute that around all the other properties. And that was really my goal. I didn't bring the culture. I defined it, and then we taught it, we measured it, we reinforced it, and we got it implemented at the other properties.
That's what good CEOs do, Joel. It's it was a blessing that you came on board, and the culture was always, at least the makings of a culture was there. You just had to figure out how to get it throughout the company, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah, there are definitely processes and procedures behind it. Jack and Pete did it through just being there every day, but they couldn't be everywhere else every day. And you understand how that happens.
I do. Okay, so then you were kind of put to the test a little bit. Your company gets a call from CBS. I don't exactly know how that happened, but maybe you can clarify that. But they basically want to do what turned out to be a hit reality show. Probably didn't even know it at the time, but called Undercover Boss. Right. They wanted your company to participate. They wanted you presumably to participate as the guy running the company, and your board and the leadership team feel so good about where your culture is that you decided to do it. Yeah. But it was risky. It was really risky, right? I mean, what if it doesn't go right? And CBS might love that, but wouldn't be good for you, wouldn't be good for your culture. So, but you did it anyway. And, you disguised yourself and you worked alongside your employees at Silver Dollar City. Tell us a little bit about that, what I think is really an interesting and exciting opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you a little bit of the background of how we got there and then what I learned from it, because I think that's informative to your audience. If your audience doesn't know, you go undercover. They don't know who you are because, this was the first year of Undercover Boss, so no one knew what was coming. Mm-hmm. And the employees are told that they are going to be filmed for a training video. I was introduced as a new employee to the industry, and they were teaching me their job so that it could be used to train other people. Right. And to your earlier point, they wanted a theme park company on Undercover Boss because it's kind of fun and entertaining and lots of moving parts. Well, they went to Disney. Disney said no. Universal said no. Six Flags said no. Cedar Fair, which is a regional competitor, said no. Legoland said no. We were like the sixth option, and
My company probably would have said no too.
What's that?
I said my company probably would have said no too.
To your point, you sign everything away. You don't get to see any of the edits, and you don't see it till it goes on national television.
Oh my goodness.
And,
Yeah.
and they can put anything they find on. So it was a tremendous risk, but it showed the confidence that the board made the decision. I was one of the board votes, but we had so much confidence in our employees that we wanted to do it. And to a bigger picture point, we were right in the middle of the recession, coming out of the 07, 08 meltdown, and our sales were still off. And we thought this would also be a good marketing element for us, a marketing tool, which worked out really, really well. But what happened, it was really interesting. One thing negative that happened is the producer was really trying to paint a negative picture. And she would hide behind the seats of the car and feed questions to the employees that were really, really negative. And I could hear her doing it over a headset. So the first night I sat down with her and I said, look, you can film any reality you want, but right now you're creating your own reality, and I'm not going to stand for that. If you're going to do that, I'm out. She goes, well, you can't. You signed a contract. I said, I don't care. You're not living up to your part of the bargain. And so, to her credit, she started just filming reality. And the thing that the show did for me, and that your audience can relate to, is when I talked about that angst in my soul earlier, I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Well, when our show viewed on CBS, it followed the NCAA national semifinals between Duke and Villanova. So there were 25 million people watching this show, watching the basketball game that came on to our show, and 98% of the people stayed. And they saw this amazing culture, these amazing employees. And when that show ended, my phone lit up. Matter of fact, we got so many emails at Hershen that our servers shut down. And we were inundated with letters of people wondering, how do you create this kind of culture? And so what that told me, Walt, is that angst I felt was millions of people in the country, they felt the same way. And that's what led me to write Love Works. Is I wanted to write a book so that all the 20 and 30 somethings and even 40 somethings learn this earlier in their life, because I was 40 years old before I went to Hershen Entertainment. I think, boy, I wish I had known all this when I was coming out of Harvard and so on and so forth. So Undercover Boss was a catalyst to write the book, and a catalyst to show me that we do have a leadership crisis, and a lot of people need to understand what's in Love Works. I'm not trying to sell the book, but it's just it's a good message.
No, it's a great message. And, I would say, Joel, in my previous company, honestly, we did everything we could to stay out of the media.
Yeah.
And instead, your board decides to run at it. And I would just say, it did work out. Congratulations on having the confidence in your people to do that.
Well, I appreciate
and
it.
obviously it worked out because you've written a terrific book that I know has changed the lives of a lot of people. So let's turn to that Love Works for a minute. I'd say a lot of people would say they understand the concept of how love works,
Right.
but they have no idea how to implement it in their business. So maybe can you give us an example of just something small, maybe that people can do every day to improve kind of their employee satisfaction, or how people feel about them?
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, though, if I can answer it two ways, I want to start at a high level that I think will be helpful to anybody on your podcast that works with cultural improvement and just trying to take good to great. And then I'll give you some specifics on what they could do starting next week. But what I find most of the time when I try to help other companies lead with love, and no matter what your cultural definition is, whatever words you use, most companies stop at putting the plaque on the wall and say, here's our values, or they talk about it, or they put it in their annual report. That's just step one. You got to define it. But then we taught it relentlessly all the time. Orientation, weekly meetings. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we taught our values and the behaviors behind them all the time. We had 3 behaviors for 7 words. So we had 21 behaviors. Each day we taught one, and we kept rotating it. And then we measured it. we leaders, the people who worked for them were asked, does this leader lead with love? Are they patient, kind, etc.? So we had measured it, we reviewed those numbers, and we only promoted people who hit both the do goals and the be goals that I mentioned earlier. They had to hit their financial numbers, but they also had to lead with love. And if you don't put all those steps in place, putting it, telling people this is my culture or our culture does nothing. It has to be backed by teaching, measuring, reviewing the numbers, and promoting people based on those numbers. And I thought I wanted to share that because I thought any of your listeners who say, well, yeah, our company talks about that, but our culture is terrible. That's usually why they miss one of those steps. And I hope that's the topic of my next book, which is kind of the 5 steps to culture transformation. But as I've gone around speaking and teaching, that's the biggest thing I see missing is they stop at the definition stage and they don't go beyond. So at a high level, that's an answer to your question of how to do it. But if I had to say, what's one thing, what's the one thing that you would change differently starting tomorrow? And it's not rocket science, and it's surprising that I would say that, but it's actually encouragement. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, nobody ever gets enough encouragement. If I ask your audience, how many of you have had too much encouragement, right? No one would say yes to that. Right. And encouragement is free, but for some reason, us as human beings, we tend to look at the negative, and we tend to not want to encourage people. We want to look at what's wrong, not what's right. So at Hershen, we were taught to encourage 3 times more than we discourage, or 3 times more than we admonished. And we were taught to always praise in public, admonish in private, but try to admonish, about 1/3 of the amount you praise. And the praise has to be authentic. It has to be earned, or you lose trust of your people. And then here's another gem that Jack taught me. He started each day in his quiet time writing a thank you note of what he saw yesterday. And he would pick 3 people, and they were really short notes. It took him 10 minutes to write 3 notes, maybe 15. Mm-hmm. But he did that since he was 22 years old. And he is now, I just talked to him yesterday, matter of fact, he's 92. Wow. He's been doing it for 70 years. That's 1,000 a year, 300 days times 3 notes, 70,000 notes out there of his encouragement. So if I had to say one thing, that would be it. If I had to say a second thing, it would be create an environment of truth. And there's a whole piece in the book about that. I won't go into the detail, but in so many companies, people are afraid to tell the truth because they feel like they're going to get, ridiculed or admonished or not promoted. So encouragement first and truthfulness second.
Joel, we had in my January series this past year, we had Chester Elton on. He's written something like 12 or 13 books. And he would say the most important thing, which really ties into your encouragement, is recognition.
Yes.
You can't really encourage without recognizing.
No, exactly.
And so I think they are really one and the same. And they've done a plethora of different studies, and they've really found that the best leaders that are out there who lead with love, as you would say, are those that are really good at recognizing. As you say, you have to train your employees first, without question. But at the end of the day, you got to encourage, recognize. They've got to see it coming from you, that you recognize the things that they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they are one and the same. And you've heard the adage, we succeed together, and when there's failure, it's on me. Jack taught me that, and I've certainly made mistakes, but always tried to use we when there's success, and always take my part of the blame if something didn't work well. Because at the end of the day, I was the top leader. The second half of my career, it's on me. But I agree with that 100%. I think recognition and encouragement go hand in hand.
Yeah. So, the flip side of that is that I'd say others might say that, look, you can't love at work and still make tough decisions. You agree with that?
I do not agree with that. But I'm actually glad you asked that question, because go back to the beginning of this podcast when we talked about the language barrier.
Yeah.
People, when they think of love, they think soft. They think of how they treat their significant other. we've already established that's a definition problem. Agape is what we're talking about. But what you just said is the second biggest reason people don't want to listen to what I'm trying to teach here, what I'm trying to say, and what you're trying to support, is they think it's soft and they think you can't hit the numbers. And it's categorically not true. And the way I would position it is, even in the 7 words of love, there's grace and truth. And the Bible's filled with grace and truth. But patience and kindness are kind of the grace part. Encourage people. Be patient. Not patient with poor performance, but don't lose your cool. Don't yell and scream in front of people. Don't make them feel lesser. There's a right way to admonish. Those are the grace pieces. Truth and trust, to me, are the accountability pieces. And when I say truth, I'm not saying, oh, tell the truth. If you lie, you're going to be fired in any company. I'm talking about 2 things: creating an environment of truth, which is one exercise, but also telling the truth about their behavior. And there's a whole chapter in the book about how do you have those difficult conversations with people. So if they're not performing, they know that. You try to get them to improve, and they're only let go if they're given that opportunity. And I will say the biggest weakness I see of all leaders that I've been around, and it took me years to learn to do this. This was one of my greatest weaknesses, is having those difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. It's telling the truth. And I know you've done it. The size of companies you've led, you know exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of leaders would rather just fire people or get rid of them without having those tough conversations. And so as long as you're doing that, leading with love is fine. And when you treat people truthfully, you also create trust. And if you have truth and trust, I think you can knock any wall down. And I will also add this one last thing on this question. The data also backs up what I'm saying. Gallup has done a huge survey of thousands of companies, millions of employees, like 45 different industries. And they've proven that companies that have really high employee engagement scores have more profitability, just what you would expect, better guest scores, better employee scores. And we found in all the companies I worked with, those who actually led with love always had the highest engagement scores. So there's a direct, correlation, a regression analysis between leading with love and getting fantastic results. So I categorically deny anyone who says you can't hit your numbers. The data says you hit your numbers better by leading with love, not leading the way General Motors led.
Yeah.
At least when I was there.
Yeah, I agree. I remember when I took over at Prologis in 2008, it was a really tough time. And, we tried to lead with love, if you will, as well. We didn't define it that way back then, but then we had to lay off a third of our workforce and talk about truth. I mean, sitting in front of the employees and basically telling them the truth about the fact that we had to lay off a third of our workforce before we knew who was going to get laid off. That was the toughest thing I had to do, but it was a tough decision. We had to do it. I loved every one of those people, but a third of them had to go, and that was really, really tough.
And when you do that, as you know, people challenge you. I've had people say, well, what do you mean? You say we're leading with love and I'm getting let go.
Yeah.
And I've had that thrown in my face. And I said, well, here's your numbers. We tried to coach you. And for the sake of the organization, we have to have people who can do both. And there's nothing easy about those conversations. I applaud you for doing that. It's hard, but the greatest, I hate to say it this way, but the greatest good is the survival of the organization.
No question about it.
If you don't deal with the non-performers, the great performers leave, as you know. And so those are the difficult, leadership. This is just slight tangent, but I think it's beneficial to your listeners. One thing Jack said to me that always stuck with me, there's 3 aspects of performance, right? There's employee scores is one, there's guest scores, and then there's financial results. Those 3 circles. He said any fool can come in and increase one Any fool can come in and increase the financial performance immediately, or improve guest scores by giving things away to the customer that for free, or they increase the employee scores by giving everybody a raise and giving them 5 more weeks vacation.
Right.
Art of leadership is the intersection of all 3 of those circles. All 3 of them have to be heading north at the same time. And that intersection that's the art of leadership. That's what you were doing when you had those tough conversations. And I really get disturbed when I see leaders come in quickly and they boost profitability by killing the other 2 circles, and there's no long-term value creation. So it's very, very important that we balance all 3 of those things as a leader.
Totally agree. Well, speaking of tough, in your book, there's a section called Love Tested, where you talk about the next phase of your career as CEO of SeaWorld. You took over a business with a tremendous brand on one hand, but in a really difficult time, and you were tested. Can you talk about that experience also, Joel?
Yeah, that was a really, really tough one. It's probably a whole nother podcast to really unpack it.
Right. I had a feeling I would open up a can of worms.
but for your audience, I think I learned a couple things. It's one thing to have competition. It's another thing to have someone out there that hates you and wants your demise. We had an enemy, and the enemy was these animal activists who were trying to shut us down. Mm-hmm. And I underestimated the veracity of their hatred. I had multiple death threats while I was CEO. One was very specific with my children's names, that we had to have security at our home. They wanted to save the whales but kill the humans. And it was very disturbing, that part of life that I had not experienced before. So that added a whole new dimension. But out of that, though, came a really strong learning for me, because everyone at SeaWorld said, you must hate those activists back. And those activists hate you, we have to hate them. And one of those activist group was the Humane Society of the United States. And a congressman from California, John Campbell, who I knew from the auto industry, also knew the CEO of the Humane Society, his name was Wayne Pacelli, the CEO of the Humane Society. And the Humane Society attacked us over and over again. They wanted us shut down. They wanted us out. Well, this congressman encouraged me to get to know Wayne. I went to Washington. We met incognito. We got to know each other. And it turns out, as you might expect, we had a lot more in common than we thought, right? We both loved animals. We both wanted the oceans to survive and thrive. And to make a very long story short, what ended up happening is, for a reason I don't have time to go into, we had to end breeding because we were outlawed from breeding orcas in California. That was legal. Our only decision was, where we going to do it in the other 2 parks. And we decided to do it at the other 2 parks because we thought, if we don't, 10 years from now, we're going to still be fighting this fight and we may be out of business. Yep. So when we made the announcement we were going to end breeding at all 3 parks, Wayne Pacelli, our enemy, came on the talk shows with me, and he supported us. And then it was amazing, because our favorability ratings went from 65% negative to literally 70% positive within 3 months. So the lesson for me was, our enemies, sometimes if we would just dialogue with them and talk, you can find common ground. And that's a lesson I wish some of our politicians would learn today. And I think your listeners can take something from that you can always find common ground. And that's the biggest positive thing I learned. The biggest negative thing I learned is an activist investor, not an animal activist, but an activist investor came in, and he was very a bully and very abusive. And I probably stuck with that too long. I tried to get him to change. He wouldn't change. The board wouldn't hold him accountable. And so we ended up parting ways, because I just couldn't stand the way he was abusing folks. But I think I would encourage your listeners, if you're ever in an abusive environment, you need to move on. You just report it if you need to report it, and then move on. Maybe I stayed a little too long because of what it did to my health. But I wanted to give you one positive and one negative that I learned from both. in SeaWorld. It didn't end the way I wanted to. I left sooner than I wanted to, but at least I learned something, which is all any of us can do when we get into a difficult situation.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Let's just talk. Let's turn to today. Um, on your website, you say your mission is to see leaders and organizations thrive with love, kind of what you're talking about. Um, you, you wrote a book, of course, you speak and you mentor C-suite execs. Tell us a little bit about what you want to accomplish in this phase in your life.
Well, really, it's in essence, it's what you just summarized. In that, I only have so many years left. I'm not. I don't want to be a full-time CEO again of a big company. You know what it takes. It's an 80-hour, 100-hour week job. I want to teach other people to love, and for me, going all the way back to what we said in the beginning, it's Jesus's number one commandment. I'd love to spend my time teaching that, regardless of where they come from a faith standpoint. I know it's the best way to lead. And so whether it's my one-on-one mentoring, I have something called Executive Circle. People can sign for it online if they want to have a group mentoring. It's kind of like a mini MBA of servant leadership, where we teach a lot of the things I'm talking about here in more depth. And then I do speaking. And really, I always do it on love, because there are so many business consultants on all the other topics. That field is well covered by excellent people, including yourself, that I tend to focus just on the love piece, and that takes up as much time as I have to give to that kind of thing. So that's where I'm focused, and it's either the one-on-one or the executive coaching or the speaking is how I do it. And it's all on joelmanby.com if anybody wants to check any of that out.
All right, so joelmanby.com. M as in Mary, ANBY.com.
Yeah.
Joel, any advice you'd give to emerging leaders today? I mean, you've been through it all, ups and downs, good and bad. Any advice that you wish you had coming out of Harvard Business School?
Yeah, I wish I had learned to not be trite about it, but I wish I did know that love works, first of all.
Yeah.
But since we've talked about that so much, I would add, always stay true to who you are. And don't, if the culture or your boss takes you away from who you want to be as a human being, take your time and don't move on quickly, but always trust your instincts and don't go away from who you are. And then always be truthful. I mean, the mistakes I've made in my own life is when I wasn't always truthful. And I've lost relationships that way, and that would be the advice I would give.
I love that. I love that. I couldn't agree with you more. Hard lesson for all of us to learn, for sure.
It is. It is.
So I like to ask each of my guests about gratitude, because I think it's really important in life. Hey, Joel, what are you most grateful for?
Well, the first thing is my faith. It has come and gone. I've had really tough times in my life where I question things, but my faith is stronger than ever, and I'm really appreciative of that. My family is the second thing, and relationships. Reconnecting with you is a real treasure for me. I just really faith, family, and friends are the things I'm the most grateful for. And it's funny, as you know, at our age, I'm saying this to your listeners, the career stuff really means very little. The more you get away from it, the more you realize it really is just relationships. And you hear that, but the older you get, the more you realize that is really all you have. And so that's what I'm grateful for.
Amen. I would say that's what I'm grateful for too. I call it the 3 F's: family, friends, and faith.
Really? I didn't.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Okay. Well,
hey, Joel, I just want to thank you for joining me on this episode, and I'm grateful to you for being on, for sharing your personal story, the meaningful work that you're doing. I mean, it's just great to reconnect with you. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I just want to thank you. I mean, it's just been great for for me to have you on. So
Well, I appreciate it, Walt, and I appreciate what you're doing. I know it's not easy to do all the podcasts, and it takes a lot of energy and time, but what you're doing is really meaningful. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I have, and I can't wait till we're both back in Florida and we can reunite more in Naples and spend some more time together.
and play some golf. Let's not forget that.
I know. We will do that. Well, thank you so much, Walt. I really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, Joel, you bet. And I just like to thank everybody who tuned in today. You can always find more insights from our guests through Off the Rak Plus, which is our newsletter. And we've got episodes, highlights, transcripts, helpful takeaways, interviews with previous guests, all those sorts of things. And I'd just like to thank you all for being on, and we'll be back on next month. Until then, I encourage all of you to be human with one another and find a way to have a positive influence on somebody around you each and every day. Thank you, everyone.